everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Human Physiology video tutorials with me, Dr. Amir Sandhu. Today we're going to talk about chronic hypertension and why some individuals have very high levels of blood pressure for a long period of time. We're going to talk specifically about the biological mechanisms which are causing a rise in blood pressure, and we're going to speak about the renal system and also about how this affects cardiac output and ultimately blood pressure. Now, I think it's very important for us to define hypertension, and especially chronic hypertension. Now, hypertension is a condition where our blood pressure is raised, and this causes several negative consequences in the body. The first of which is it increases the workload of the heart, because if we have increased pressure in our circulatory system, the heart has to work harder to pump blood around the body. This will compromise the function of the heart, and usually you get a thickening of the mass of the left ventricle, and eventually the heart does not get enough well perfused blood, and you can actually develop heart failure as well, and the heart will then not be able to pump enough blood around the body. Now, the other consequences is that if you have high pressure in your circulatory system, you will start to cause damage to the blood vessels of the brain, which can increase the risk of stroke, and you will also cause damage to the blood vessels of the heart, the coronary circulation, and that obviously increases your susceptibility to develop a heart attack. Now, the other negative consequences of having high blood pressure is damage to the kidneys. And as we're going to find out in today's episode, the kidneys are vital for regulating long-term blood pressure. Now, let's first define chronic hypertension. Now, an individual is deemed to have hypertension when their mean arterial pressure is greater than 110 millimeters of mercury. And this is measured in the standard way with a blood pressure cuff. Now, the normal mean arterial pressure, and I'll put that in green, is 90 millimeters of mercury. So this would be a healthy mean arterial pressure. Now, the mean arterial pressure is the pressure during systole, which is the phase of contracting of the heart, causing blood to go to the rest of the body, and also the pressure during diastole, which is the slightly longer period of the cardiac cycle when the heart is actually not contracting, but there is still pressure in the circulatory system. So it's a combination of both of those two states of the cardiac cycle. Now, the mean arterial pressure of 110 millimeters of mercury equates to a systolic blood pressure, which I'm going to just abbreviate here, of approximately 135 millimeters of mercury, and a diastolic blood pressure of around 90 millimeters of mercury. Now, we know that if you go to the doctor, if you have a blood pressure, a systolic reading of around 140 millimeters of mercury and the diastolic is 90, then you are classed as being hypertensive. Now, 135 over 90 would put you into the category where you have preclinical hypertension. So we get this increase in mean arterial pressure, and that basically means that the circulatory system, the blood vessels have an increased force being exerted on their vascular wall. And it also means that the heart has to overcome a greater pressure to get blood from the left ventricle into the aorta and to the rest of the body. Now, why do we get chronic hypertension? The reason why we get chronic hypertension is something called volume loading hypertension. The simplest way to look at this is if I was to have a glass of water, I drink a glass of water, I'm going to increase my extracellular fluid. Okay, so the extracellular fluid is the fluid that is around our cells. So we've got multiple cells within the body, we've got a nucleus there of a cell. The extracellular fluid, which I'm going to abbreviate as ECF, is the fluid which is outside of our cells. We'll also have blood vessels as well that are supplying that cell. Okay, now the blood vessels will have something called intravascular fluid, and that is also classed as a form of extracellular fluid. That's also categorized under extracellular fluid. Now, if I was to drink water, I'd get an increase in extracellular fluid inside the blood vessels around the cells, and that's going to increase the blood volume. So essentially, increasing the fluid within the body, increasing the extracellular fluid, equals an increase in the blood volume. Now, if I get an increase in blood volume, the next thing that actually happens is an increase in venous return to the heart and greater cardiac output. And cardiac output is one of the deciding factors for blood pressure. If we have increased cardiac output, then we will get increased blood pressure. So by increasing our fluid intake and salt intake as well, we are increasing our extracellular fluid, which increases our blood volume. Now, just staying along this theme, in a normal healthy person, what we would actually get is the renal system coming into play and trying to reduce the blood volume and causing a reduction in blood pressure. And the way that this would be done is by looking at the renal output curve. So what we've got here is the arterial pressure, okay? Arterial pressure, so we go to 0, 50, 100, 150, and 200. And then what we've actually got next is the output curve, the renal output of fluid. And of course salt as well, okay? And we can put this as times normal. And we've got 2, 4, 6, 8. Now, what I mentioned there was the renal output curve, okay? So what we've actually got with the kidneys is something called the renal output curve. Now, this represents what happens when we increase our blood volume by taking on extra fluid and salt. So just to label this up, renal output curve. And what we can actually see here is quite straightforward. Now, as your blood pressure starts to increase, so as we go from 100 millimeters of mercury to 150, the amount of fluid excreted by your kidneys is also increased as well. And that has a net effect of reducing the blood volume. So we can see here that at 150 to 200 millimeters of mercury of blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, we're having somewhere between 6 to 8 times the increase in renal output. So this is fluid going into your urine, and then you obviously urinate, and then you're getting a drop in blood volume. So your kidneys are actually helping to keep your blood pressure down by getting rid of excess fluid and reducing that blood volume. And this, in its simplest form, is the renal output curve. Now, there are 2 terms that you need to be familiar with. One is called pressure diuresis, and this curve is basically pressure diuresis. So this is the response of the kidneys to high blood pressure. So when we get high blood pressure, we get pressure diuresis. So the pressure stimulates the kidneys to cause a loss of fluid, to be excreted in the urine, and a drop in blood volume. And it's the same with pressure natriuresis, pressure natriuresis, which is the excretion of salt to cause a reduction in blood pressure. We're going to talk a little bit more about salt in the second part of this video and how that increases blood pressure, but essentially this curve represents pressure diuresis. We take on fluid, we get an increase in our blood pressure because of an increase in extracellular fluid and blood volume. So we then have the kidneys which are excreting that fluid out into the urine, and we get a reduction in blood pressure because the blood volume is reducing. So this is what would happen in a healthy person. We'd have pressure diuresis and pressure natriuresis. This would be happening all the time to make sure that your blood pressure is at the right level. Now, it's very important that we're able to understand 2 more important concepts. Okay, and now this relates to the amount of water and salt that we intake and the renal output of that same water and salt. That needs to be matched, and of course that's then linked to the blood pressure. Now I'll explain to you what I mean with this graph here, okay? So this is the intake or output of water, H2O, and salt, okay? And at the bottom here, we've got, again, arterial pressure in millimeters of mercury. Okay, now what I'm going to draw across here is a line. This line is the amount of, this is basically the water and salt intake. So we'll put this here, water and salt intake. This is what you're getting in your diet. Okay, and then we've got the blood pressures, which are just starting across here. So we've got 50, 100, 150, and then we move on to 200. Okay, so this is our blood pressure along the continuum here, and then as before, we've actually got 2, 4, 6, 8. Now what we're actually going to do is draw the renal output curve again. So as I said in the previous drawing, an increase in pressure will cause pressure diuresis and we'll get a reduction in blood volume. Now what we can actually see, and what's important about this, is that with blood pressure regulation, we always have something called the set point or the equilibrium point. So this is the put an I there, equilibrium point. And essentially, at this point here, the amount of water and salt intake matches the amount of water and salt being excreted by the kidneys. And this happens at around 100 millimeters of mercury blood pressure. We can move this across here a little bit, but this happens at 100 millimeters of mercury mean arterial pressure. Okay, and this is the equilibrium point. Now, what we will find is that at very high pressures, so for example, if I just use a different colored pen, so at 150, we're getting, at 150 millimeters of mercury, we're getting 3 times as much renal output of water and salt to try and bring the blood pressure down. So an increase in blood pressure from 100 to 150, that's 50 millimeters of mercury, will result in your kidneys increasing the amount of water that they are excreting, the amount of water and salt they are excreting by 3 times normal. Okay, so this is the intake or output of water and salt times normal. Times what would be normal, and normal would be here at the equilibrium point. Now, for various reasons, we can actually have changes in these set points, okay, in this equilibrium point. Now, the reason why we get changes are due to an increase in the blood pressure. So we may have, if I use another color, so we may actually have a shift of the curve to the right, and now what we can see is the set point is at a much higher blood pressure. So we've seen that the set point, the equilibrium point, has now changed and is occurring at a much higher blood pressure above 150 millimeters of mercury. That's one way of actually changing the regulation of blood pressure, which might contribute to hypertension. Why would that shift to the right? It could be damage to the kidneys so that they're not able to clear out enough fluid, okay, or enough salt, so blood pressure remains high because blood volume remains high. So that could be one reason. Or the amount of salt that we're intaking in our diet could also increase. So that's another reason, that's the second reason why we might get chronic hypertension as a result of a change in the set point. And what we can see here, again, is a new set point, a new equilibrium point. So we can see that in a healthy person, it's regulated at 100 millimeters of mercury, and the amount of fluid and salt that you're taking in your diet is matching the amount that's being excreted from the kidneys. But if you have a shift in the pressure curve towards the right because of abnormalities in kidney function, then you're going to have this equilibrium point at a much higher blood pressure. So the intake of water and salt and the renal output of water and salt will be setting and occurring at a much higher level. The balance of those two will be occurring at a much higher pressure. Similarly, if you have an increase in salt intake, again, you will have an increase in the set point so that you will have, again, a higher blood pressure. This is also equating to a higher blood pressure. So hopefully this is actually making sense. This is the renal output curve and representing the pressure diuresis and the pressure natriuresis, okay? And the whole point of getting chronic hypertension is that you're having a shift in the curve to the right and an increase in the normal intake of water and salt, which is causing the set point to be occurring at a much higher blood pressure. Okay, so that's the most important concept to really understand about changes to the blood pressure over a long period of time. But what actually is happening in the rest of the body as this takes place? So before we actually do that, we need to actually go back to the beginning again, and we need to think about why we get high blood pressure. So we get chronic hypertension because we get an increase in our extracellular fluid, okay, the amount of that fluid, so we'll pop in volume here, okay, that will then cause an increase in the blood volume. Okay, so if you've got extra cellular fluid increase because of water and salt intake, then you're obviously going to have an increase in blood volume. That's going to increase the circulatory filling pressure. Okay, now this is a new word that new term that I've actually added. Now, the circulatory filling pressure is the pressure in your blood vessels when they are all equally filled with blood. So if you imagine the heart pumping the blood to all of the body, once that blood gets to each of the vessels and it's distributed equally, that is the circulatory filling pressure, and that would increase if the blood volume was to increase. Now, the next step is an increase in venous return. And we know that anything that increases venous return will also increase cardiac output. And in turn, the most significant factor which regulates our blood pressure is an increase in cardiac output, and we'll then get an increased blood pressure. Okay? Now, what's important here is that we have an increase in cardiac output causing an increase in blood pressure because of the increase in venous return, and we can feed this all the way back to that increase in fluid intake that we are taking to increase the extracellular fluid volume. But there is also another mechanism which increases blood pressure within our body, and it's called the systemic vascular resistance. Now, it's very important that when we look at systemic vascular resistance, we understand why it actually occurs, because many people wrongly assume systemic vascular resistance to be the cause of high blood pressure. But this is not the case. Now, let's see why. Now, we get an increase in systemic vascular resistance for one reason. When you get an increase in cardiac output, you've got more blood flow going to your tissues, to your muscles, to your organs. Now, if you were exercising, that's fine. You know, we want more blood going to the muscles, particularly. But if you're at rest and you've got an increase in cardiac output, then it's going to have undesirable effects in the tissues. You'll have an increase in blood flow to the tissues, and the blood isn't needed there. So we have what's called autoregulation. We have autoregulatory mechanisms. Now, autoregulation basically means that when your heart pumps blood to the tissues, and let's use the skeletal muscles as an example, the blood vessels of the skeletal muscles will actually constrict, so they will have vasoconstriction to stop the increased amount of blood and the pressure within that tissue. So you'll have an autoregulatory mechanism which causes constriction of the local blood vessels in that tissue, but this will cause an increase in systemic vascular resistance. Okay, that's how we get an increase in systemic vascular resistance from high blood pressure. We have increased blood flow going to the tissues, and then we get autoregulation in the local blood vessels of that tissue, which cause vasoconstriction. And when we get generalized vasoconstriction in the body, that increases pressure. You know, whenever you squeeze something, then you're obviously going to increase the pressure. And certainly the heart then has to contract with greater force to overcome that pressure within the circulatory system. So we've got this autoregulation, and then we get an increase in total peripheral resistance or systemic vascular resistance. Total peripheral resistance or systemic vascular resistance are very similar things that are happening within the body, but it's this generalized vasoconstriction which increases blood pressure. Now, many people actually assume that this is the cause of blood pressure, but what we can see from here is it's actually a consequence of increased blood pressure. It's not the cause, it's a consequence of the increased blood pressure. Now, I do need to just add a note here, is that in certain conditions you do get dysfunction of the blood vessels and you get vasoconstriction, you get enhanced sympathetic nervous system activity, which could cause an increase in systemic vascular resistance and drive the long-term increases in blood pressure. But when we're looking at this from a purely biological point of view, what's going on, then it's actually the increase in volume that drives the blood pressure. To support my point further, what I would say is that if we get an increase in total peripheral resistance, systemic vascular resistance, and we get this increase in blood pressure, in a healthy person, what will actually happen is we'll get that pressure diuresis again. So remember, we go back to that renal output curve, pressure would shoot up. This is your renal output curve, as we said before. And you'd get an increased excretion of the fluid and the salt from the kidneys, and your blood pressure would go back down again. So this mechanism here, the renal system would be working, and would be just looking at the renal output curve to tell us this is what happens. We get this increase in blood pressure, and the blood pressure would go back down again. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. The key thing really is an increase in extracellular fluid volume causes an increase in blood volume. Ultimately, that leads to increase in venous return, greater cardiac output, which directly increases blood pressure. Okay, but we also have autoregulatory mechanisms which cause an increase in total peripheral resistance, which also drives blood pressure. But in a healthy person, what we would then have is the renal system attempting to get rid of the excess fluid and salt for blood volume to go back down, and blood pressure would go back down again as well. Okay, now it's very important to kind of get this concept understood into your mind, that changes in blood volume have a significant impact on the general blood pressure. So that's basically the end of the first part of this video. In the next part, we're going to talk about some key hormones and how they are important in regulating renal function and long-term blood pressure. And then we will also go on to discuss the role of salt intake and how that causes changes internally in the renal system to increase blood volume and then blood pressure. Thank you very much for your time.